The snowbound cabin. The snowstorm had arrived suddenly, sweeping across the small mountain town like a roaring beast. By the time Emily and her friends realized the severity of the weather, they were already halfway up the isolated trail leading to their rented cabin. What was supposed to be a weekend of relaxation turned into a desperate fight against the elements. Emily, a cautious city girl, had hesitated to join the trip, but her best friend, Vanessa, had been insistent. "We'll disconnect from everything. Just us, nature, and some hot chocolate by the fire," Vanessa had said. The group, 4 friends in total, had laughed about the idea of roughing it in a cozy, well-equipped cabin. The first sign of trouble came when the car skidded off the icy road. After an hour of trudging through knee-deep snow, they finally saw the silhouette of the cabin against the swirling white storm. Relief washed over them as they pushed open the heavy wooden door, shaking off snow and cold. Inside, the air was stale, carrying an odd, metallic tang. Dust motes danced in the dim light filtering through frosted windows. The furniture was old but sturdy, and the fireplace dominated one wall, stacked with logs ready to burn. Vanessa quickly got to work lighting the fire while Chris and Ian, the other 2 members of their group, brought in the bags. The first few hours passed uneventfully. They joked, unpacked supplies, and played cards by the fire. But as the storm raged on, a sense of unease began to settle over Emily. It started small, a soft scratching noise outside, almost inaudible beneath the howl of the wind. At first, they dismissed it as branches scraping against the cabin. But when Vanessa went to refill her mug from the kitchen, she froze. "Guys," she whispered, her voice trembling, "come here." They gathered around her, peering out the small kitchen window. The storm was blinding, but a faint outline was visible. Something humanoid, standing motionless just beyond the edge of the porch. "Is someone out there?" Ian asked, his voice uncertain. Emily's stomach tightened. No one could survive out there without proper gear. "It's too cold." Chris grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the storm. The figure remained still, just barely visible in the beam. It didn't move or respond. "Probably just a trick of the light," Chris said, but his voice lacked conviction. He shut the blinds, and they returned to the living room, trying to shake off the eerie moment. The hours dragged on, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. As night fell, the cabin grew colder despite the roaring fire. Emily noticed something peculiar. No matter how much wood they burned, the room never seemed to warm. Instead, the cold crept in like an invisible predator, seeping through walls and floors. Around midnight, the power flickered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. Panic set in as they scrambled for flashlights and candles. That's when they heard it, a distinct knock on the front door. 3 deliberate, hollow thuds. Everyone froze. Who the hell would be out in this storm? Chris whispered. No one moved. The knock came again, louder this time. Vanessa reached for her phone, but there was no signal. Chris, ever the skeptic, grabbed a poker from the fireplace. "I'll check it out." "No," Emily hissed. "What if it's—" "What? A monster?" "Come on," Chris scoffed. But his bravado faltered as he approached the door. With a deep breath, he unlocked it and swung it open. The porch was empty. Snow whipped inside, stinging their skin. But the figure from earlier was gone, leaving only faint footprints leading into the woods. Chris slammed the door shut. No one's there. Probably just a tree branch or something. But Emily wasn't convinced. She could feel eyes on her, a heavy, suffocating presence. They all returned to the fire, huddling together in uneasy silence. At 3 a.m., the scratching began again, louder this time, as if claws were raking against the walls. Vanessa screamed as the sound moved to the windows, circling the cabin like a predator. Ian yelled, "What do you want?" but received no reply. Suddenly, the sound stopped. An oppressive silence fell over the cabin. Emily's breath caught in her throat when she noticed something on the frosted window pane. A handprint, large and skeletal, pressed firmly against the glass. The door burst open with a deafening crash, though the lock had been bolted. Snow and wind swirled inside, and in the chaos, Emily glimpsed it, a grotesque figure, half human, half something else, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. It moved unnaturally, its limbs jerking like a marionette's. Vanessa screamed as it lunged toward her. Ian and Chris tried to fight it off, but the creature was impossibly strong. Emily grabbed a burning log from the fire and swung it wildly, the flames casting monstrous shadows on the walls. The creature recoiled, shrieking a sound that was both human and inhuman. It retreated into the storm, leaving the door wide open. By dawn, the storm had subsided. Exhausted and terrified, the group stumbled down the trail to safety. When they reported the incident to the authorities, the sheriff gave them a grim look. "That cabin's been abandoned for years," he said. "The last group that stayed there disappeared without a trace. You're lucky to be alive." Back in the city, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped unscathed. Every winter, when the snow fell thick and heavy, she swore she could hear scratching at her windows, a reminder that some things don't stay buried in the cold. The frozen lake. The town of Silver Pines had always been a quiet, unassuming place. Nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests and towering mountains, it thrived on its snowy winters and picturesque landscapes. But the lake at the edge of town, Lake Malheur, held a sinister reputation. Its icy waters were said to never thaw, no matter how warm the summers became. The locals avoided it, warning of the frozen curse. But no one ever explained exactly what that meant. Lena didn't believe in curses. She was a journalist from the city, sent to Silver Pines to write a human interest piece on the town's winter festival. When she first heard about the lake, her curiosity flared. It wasn't part of her assignment, but the mystery of Lake Malheur was too tempting to resist. Her chance came on the second day of the festival when she overheard a group of teenagers daring each other to walk across the lake's frozen surface. "You wouldn't make it halfway," a boy said, shoving his friend. "That ice will pull you under." His friend laughed nervously. "It's just a lake. Ice doesn't pull anyone under." "Tell that to the Carter family," the boy retorted. "All four of them gone. No one ever found their bodies." Lena approached them. "What happened to the Carter family?" The boys exchanged uneasy glances. One finally answered, "It was years ago. They tried to skate on the lake, but the ice cracked. People say the lake took them, like swallowed them whole." It was the kind of story Lena lived for. That night, while the festival fireworks lit up the sky, she grabbed her camera and headed toward the lake. The air was bitterly cold, and the snow muffled her footsteps. When she reached the shoreline, she paused. The lake was massive, stretching far beyond what she could see in the moonlight. Its surface was eerily smooth, glistening like black glass beneath the faint glow of the sky. Lena's breath fogged the air as she set up her tripod. She wanted to capture the haunting beauty of the place before stepping out onto the ice. Her boots crunched against the frozen surface. The ice felt solid beneath her feet, but a deep unease settled in her chest. She ventured farther, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional groan of shifting ice. Suddenly, she spotted something, a faint shadow beneath the ice. Lena crouched down, wiping frost from the surface with her glove. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a face. A woman's face, pale and lifeless, stared up at her from beneath the ice. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. Lena stumbled back, nearly dropping her flashlight. Her heart raced as she scanned the surface, and to her horror, more faces appeared. Men, women, children, all staring up at her from the frozen depths. She turned to run but slipped, falling hard onto the ice. The flashlight skittered away, casting erratic beams of light. As she scrambled to her feet, she heard it, a faint whisper, like the rustling of leaves. "Stay. Lena froze, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Stay with us." The ice beneath her began to creak. She looked down and saw cracks spiderwebbing outward, glowing faintly blue. Panic seized her as she ran toward the shore, but the ice shifted beneath her, almost as if it were alive. She slipped again, this time landing face first. The cold bit into her skin as she clawed at the ice, trying to stand. That's when she felt it, something grabbing her ankle. She screamed, kicking wildly, but the grip was impossibly strong. She turned to see a hand, pale and skeletal, reaching up through the ice. Its fingers were icy claws, digging into her boot. More hands emerged around her, clawing and grasping, their translucent forms glowing faintly beneath the ice. Lena thrashed, managing to free herself. She crawled, sobbing and gasping, until she finally reached the shore. Collapsing onto the snow, she turned back to the lake. The surface was smooth again, as if nothing had happened, but the whispers remained, faint and chilling. "Stay." Lena returned to her hotel, shaken but alive. She told no one what she had seen, afraid of being dismissed as crazy. But she couldn't stop thinking about the faces, the sheer terror in their eyes. She began researching the lake's history and discovered a grim pattern. Every few years, someone disappeared near Lake Malheur. Their bodies never recovered. Her article about the winter festival was published, but Lena couldn't let the lake go. She visited again, this time in daylight, determined to document the phenomenon. But the ice revealed nothing. No faces, no glowing cracks. It was just a frozen expanse, silent and unyielding. That night, back in her hotel room, Lena heard it again. The whisper. "Stay." She froze, her heart pounding. The sound grew louder, more insistent. She turned to the window and saw frost creeping across the glass, forming words. "You belong to us now." The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Lena grabbed her phone, but it wouldn't turn on. Her breath fogged the air as the temperature plummeted. And then, she saw them. Shadows moving toward her, their eyes glowing faintly blue. The last thing she heard was the sound of cracking ice. The next morning, the hotel staff found Lena's room empty. Her belongings were undisturbed, but her boots were missing, along with her winter coat. Search parties scoured the area, but she was never found. Months later, a group of teenagers dared each other to walk across Lake Malheur. They returned safely, laughing at the old stories. But one of them swore he saw something beneath the ice. A woman's face, staring up at him, her eyes filled with terror. And when the wind howled through the valley, it almost sounded like a whisper. "Stay." The Icebound Asylum. In the farthest reaches of the northern tundra stood Blackthorn Asylum, an imposing stone structure that had been abandoned for nearly a century. Its windows were shattered, its walls scarred by time and frost, and its iron gates hung askew like crooked teeth. Locals avoided the asylum, even in daylight. They spoke of the icebound hauntings, rumors of chilling screams, and ghostly figures seen wandering the snow. Michael was a documentary filmmaker with a reputation for debunking urban legends. When he heard about Blackthorn Asylum, he knew it was the perfect subject for his next project. Armed with cameras, recording equipment, and a team of 3. His girlfriend Sarah, his cameraman Dylan, and his tech expert Kim. Michael set out to uncover the truth. They arrived during the coldest week of the year. Snow blanketed the landscape, and the temperature was so low their breath froze in the air. The asylum loomed before them like a giant gravestone, its shadow stretching across the icy ground. "This place is incredible," Michael said, his excitement barely contained. "Let's get inside before we freeze." The main doors groaned open with a deafening creak, revealing a cavernous lobby shrouded in darkness. Their flashlights illuminated peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and graffiti scrawled in languages none of them recognized. The air was frigid, colder than it had been outside. "This doesn't make sense," Kim muttered. checking her thermometer. It's at least 20 degrees colder in here. Old buildings are like that, Michael replied, though his tone was uncertain. They began their exploration, setting up cameras in key locations: the infirmary, the solitary confinement wing, and the director's office. The asylum's history was grim. It had housed the criminally insane, and according to legend, its patients were subjected to brutal experiments. Some claim the asylum's director, Dr. Elias Greaves, had been obsessed with finding a way to preserve human consciousness, using methods that were both cruel and unnatural. By nightfall, the team had gathered hours of footage, but no concrete evidence. They decided to conduct an overnight investigation, splitting into pairs to cover more ground. Michael and Sarah took the second floor, while Dylan and Kim stayed on the first. As the hours dragged on, the temperature continued to drop. Sarah shivered despite wearing 3 layers of clothing. "It feels like the cold is alive," she said, her breath misting in the beam of her flashlight. Michael chuckled nervously. "You're letting the stories get to you." But he felt it too, a heavy, oppressive chill that seemed to seep into his bones. Downstairs, Dylan and Kim were reviewing footage when they heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It echoed through the empty halls, growing louder and more insistent. "Do you hear that?" Kim whispered. Dylan nodded, grabbing his camera. They followed the sound to the infirmary, where rows of rusted hospital beds sat in eerie silence. The tapping stopped as they entered. Dylan panned his camera across the room, and that's when they saw it, a shadow darting past the far doorway. "Did you see that?" Kim hissed. "Yeah," Dylan whispered, his hands trembling. "Let's check it out." They moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the snow that had drifted through broken windows. When they reached the doorway, the corridor beyond was empty. But the air felt wrong, thick, heavy, and suffocating. Kim's voice cracked as she whispered, "We should go back." Before Dylan could respond, the tapping resumed, this time from behind them. They spun around to see a figure standing in the infirmary. It was humanoid but grotesquely distorted, its limbs too long and its face obscured by a veil of frost. Its head tilted unnaturally, and it raised one skeletal hand to point directly at them. Kim screamed as the lights on their cameras flickered and died. The temperature plummeted further, and a deafening shriek filled the air, as if the building itself were alive and screaming in agony. Upstairs, Michael and Sarah heard the noise and froze. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered. Michael grabbed his walkie-talkie. "Dylan? Kim? Are you guys okay?" Static crackled in response, followed by a distorted voice that wasn't Dylan's. "You shouldn't be here." Michael's blood ran cold. "Dylan? Kim? Answer me." The voice came again, louder this time. "Leave or join us." Suddenly, the hallway lights flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. One shadow moved differently, slithering toward them like a living thing. Sarah grabbed Michael's arm. "We need to get out of here. Now." But the shadow was too fast. It surged forward, engulfing the corridor in darkness. Michael and Sarah stumbled blindly, their flashlights barely piercing the blackness. A low, guttural growl echoed around them, followed by the sound of scraping metal. "Run!" Michael shouted, pulling Sarah toward the stairs. Meanwhile, Dylan and Kim were trapped in the infirmary. The frost-covered figure advanced slowly, its hollow eyes glowing faintly blue. Every step it took made the air colder, until Kim's breath froze in her throat. She collapsed, clutching her chest as icicles began to form on her eyelashes. Dylan tried to drag her away, but the figure reached out, its skeletal hand brushing against his shoulder. Agony shot through him as frost spread across his skin, turning his flesh gray and brittle. He screamed, but the sound was lost in the deafening cold. Michael and Sarah burst into the lobby, gasping for air. The temperature had dropped so low their bodies were numb. They didn't see Dylan or Kim, but something else awaited them. In the center of the lobby stood a man in a tattered lab coat. His face was pale, his eyes empty sockets filled with swirling frost. Michael recognized him from an old photograph, Dr. Elias Greaves. "You came to see," the figure rasped, his voice like cracking ice. "Now you'll stay forever." The doors slammed shut, trapping them inside. Frost spread across the walls, sealing every exit. Michael and Sarah screamed as Dr. Greaves raised his arms, and the darkness swallowed them whole. When a rescue team arrived days later, the asylum was empty. The team's equipment was found frozen solid, their cameras capturing only distorted images of frost and shadows. No trace of Michael, Sarah, Dylan, or Kim was ever discovered. But on cold winter nights, locals claim they can see lights flickering in the asylum's windows. And if you listen closely, you can hear faint whispers carried on the icy wind. Join us. Stay forever. The White Wraith. The remote village of Frostmoor was buried deep in the Arctic wilderness, a cluster of wooden cottages huddled together against the relentless cold. Its population was sparse, and its traditions were steeped in superstition. The villagers spoke of a legend passed down for generations, a vengeful spirit known as the White Wraith, said to appear during the harshest winters. According to the legend, the Wraith was a woman who had perished in the snow centuries ago, betrayed and left to die by the very people she trusted. Her soul, consumed by rage and sorrow, returned to haunt the living. She was said to appear as a pale, ethereal figure wrapped in a tattered white cloak, her face obscured by frost and shadow. Those who saw her never lived to tell the tale. Ella, a young anthropologist, arrived in Frostmoor during the coldest winter in decades. She was researching Arctic folklore for her doctoral thesis and had heard whispers of the White Wraith from a colleague. While the villagers were polite, they became uneasy whenever she mentioned the spirit. "You shouldn't speak of her," an elderly woman named Marta warned. "Words have power, especially in winter." Ella dismissed the warnings as superstition. She was determined to uncover the truth behind the legend, convinced it was rooted in real events. Her research led her to an abandoned cabin on the outskirts of the village, where the supposed betrayal had taken place centuries ago. The villagers refused to go near it, claiming the wraith lingered there. Against their advice, Ella packed her camera, notebook, and a thermal blanket, setting out for the cabin just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The cabin was a forlorn structure, half buried in snow and leaning precariously against the wind. Its windows were shattered, and its roof sagged under the weight of ice. Ella pushed the door open, her breath fogging in the icy air. Inside, the cabin was eerily silent. Broken furniture and frost-covered debris littered the floor. The walls were marked with strange, jagged symbols that looked like claw marks. Ella snapped photos and recorded notes, her excitement mounting. She felt like she was uncovering a piece of lost history. As she worked, the temperature seemed to drop further. Her fingers ached with cold, even through her gloves. She heard a faint sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. She turned, her flashlight cutting through the gloom, but saw nothing. "It's just the wind," she muttered, trying to steady her nerves. But the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't random sounds but words, spoken in a language she didn't understand. Ella's pulse quickened as the cabin's shadows seemed to deepen. Her flashlight flickered. Then she saw it. A figure stood in the doorway, shrouded in swirling snow. It was tall and thin, its form almost translucent, as if it were made of frost and moonlight. A tattered white cloak billowed around it, though there was no wind inside the cabin. Its face was obscured, but its eyes glowed faintly, like distant stars. Ella froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure stepped forward, and the air grew so cold she could feel ice forming on her eyelashes. She tried to speak, to move, but her body refused to obey. The wraith raised an arm, its fingers elongated and sharp like icicles. A voice echoed in Ella's mind, cold and mournful. "Why have you come here?" I, I wanted to learn, Ella stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I wanted to understand your story. The wraith tilted its head, the glow of its eyes intensifying. My story, it repeated, its voice filled with bitter sorrow. They betrayed me, left me to die in the snow, and now they all pay. The whispers around Ella grew deafening, a cacophony of voices filled with anguish and rage. The wraith extended its hand, and frost began to creep across the floor toward Ella. She felt the cold climbing her legs, numbing her skin. Wait, she cried. I'm not from the village. I didn't betray you. The wraith paused, its gaze piercing. No, but you are here, and the cold claims all who trespass. Desperation overtook Ella. Please, I can help you. I can tell your story. People will know what happened to you. They'll remember. For a moment, the whispers ceased. The wraith loomed over her, its form shifting and flickering like a dying flame. If you speak my name, it said, you will carry my curse. Ella nodded frantically. I'll do it. I swear. The wraith leaned closer, and for the first time, Ella saw its face. It was neither human nor inhuman, a visage of frozen anguish, its features etched with frost and shadow. Its voice was a hollow whisper. Leora. With that, the wraith vanished, and the cabin was plunged into silence. The frost receded, and the air grew warmer, though Ella still shivered. She gathered her equipment and fled, her mind racing. Back in the village, Ella recorded everything she had experienced. She wrote an article detailing the legend of Leora and the betrayal that had condemned her to eternal torment. The piece gained attention, spreading the story far beyond Frostmoor. But strange things began to happen. Those who read Ella's article reported hearing whispers in the night. Some claimed to see a pale figure standing in the snow, watching them from afar. And Ella herself was not immune. One night, she awoke to find frost creeping across her bedroom walls. The air was so cold her breath hung in the air, and a familiar voice whispered in her ear, "You carry my curse." Ella's screams were lost in the howling wind as the room grew dark and the frost consumed her. Now, her story is another part of the legend. Those who speak of the White Wraith say her name with caution, for to utter Leora is to invite the cold and the wraith into your life. The Frostbitten Child. The small town of Winterbrook sat at the foot of a snow-capped mountain range, isolated from the rest of the world for months each year. The bitter winds of the northern tundra kept it cut off from any form of warmth, physically and metaphorically. During the winter months, the town almost seemed to disappear into the landscape, buried under a thick blanket of snow and ice. Its few inhabitants huddled inside their homes, waiting for spring's mercy. But even the toughest of winters could not keep the people of Winterbrook from celebrating one of their most treasured traditions, the Winter Feast. Every year, they gathered in the town hall, a sturdy wooden building at the heart of town, to share a meal and stories. It was a time for laughter, warmth, and remembering those who had passed. It was also a time when they honored the child. The child of Winterbrook had become a local legend, part of the town's folklore. Every winter, during the darkest night, a child would appear at the edge of the village. They would be bundled in layers of tattered clothes, their small hands clutching a cold, empty basket. No one knew where the child came from, but it was said that whoever gave the child a meal would be granted a year of prosperity and health. But if the child was turned away, the consequences were far worse than anything the village could imagine. Nora had heard the stories, of course. She'd grown up in Winterbrook and had always been told about the child, but she never put much stock in it. Like many in the town, she believed it was a superstition, a way to keep the younger generations from straying too far into the frozen wilderness during the harshest months. But this year, the story would prove to be all too real. It was the night of the Winter Feast. Nora had arrived at the town hall early, helping to prepare the meal, a hearty stew and freshly baked bread, and setting out chairs for the gathering. The cold outside was biting, and the windows of the hall were frosted over, distorting the view of the dark, snow-covered street. As the night wore on, laughter and music filled the hall, and everyone was in good spirits. But as the hour grew late, a strange tension began to hang in the air. People grew quiet, looking over their shoulders as if expecting something to happen. Nora noticed the unease in the room, but thought little of it. It wasn't until she stepped outside for a moment to catch her breath that she saw the child. A small figure stood at the edge of the street, silhouetted against the dark expanse of snow. The child was no more than 6 or 7 years old, their face hidden beneath a hood and scarf. The basket they held was empty, its woven fibers stretched thin, as if it had been worn down by time and the weight of too many journeys. Nora's heart skipped a beat. She knew the story all too well, and though she didn't believe in it, a chill crept up her spine. The child stood motionless, staring directly at her, its small hands clutched around the basket. Nora felt compelled to approach, though something in her gut told her not to. As she stepped closer, she noticed that the child was not as cold as they should have been. The temperature around them had dropped significantly, the air thick and frosty. Yet the child's clothes, though ragged, were not covered in snow, nor did they seem to feel the biting wind. Their skin was unnaturally pale, their cheeks sharp and hollow, their eyes dark and endless, black as the midnight sky. Nora hesitated. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The child didn't respond, their gaze never leaving her. Then, very slowly, they raised the empty basket, turning it toward her. Nora's heart pounded in her chest. It was then that she realized this wasn't just a child. This was the child of Winterbrook, the one spoken of in the old tales. The one who could bring either blessing or curse. The child's lips parted in a thin, icy smile. "Give me something," they said, their voice faint but clear. "Give me something to fill my basket." Nora's breath hitched. The stories always said that if you gave the child food, you would be blessed. The entire town lived by this tradition. Everyone had always given generously, offering the child whatever they had on hand. A piece of bread, a bowl of stew, a handful of berries. And in return, the village would thrive for another year. But tonight, Nora wasn't sure. The child's eyes, those endless, dark eyes, held something unnatural, something hollow. The cold that emanated from them felt wrong, as if it seeped directly into her bones. I don't have anything," Nora said, her voice trembling. The child's smile faded, and they stepped closer, the air around them growing colder still. "Then I will take from you." Before Nora could react, the child's tiny hand shot out, grabbing hold of her wrist with unnatural strength. The skin where they touched her began to freeze, a creeping numbness spreading up her arm. She gasped, trying to pull away, but the child's grip was ironclad. "Please," Nora begged, her breath a cloud of mist. "I can't. I don't have anything." The child's black eyes glowed faintly. "You have something." Nora's pulse raced as the child's icy grip tightened, and that's when she felt it, the sudden emptiness inside her. Like something was being pulled from her, something vital, something that left her weak and hollow. Her vision blurred as her strength drained away. Inside the town hall, the feast was continuing. Laughter echoed in the hall, but no one outside had noticed Nora's absence. No one saw her struggle against the child in the cold. No one heard her frantic cries for help as the child's frigid touch drained the life from her. Back in the street, Nora staggered, her body trembling with cold, her legs unsteady. The child released her wrist, and she crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. She could feel her heart slowing, her limbs growing numb. The child looked down at her, tilting their head with a curious expression. "You refused me. Now you will give me what I came for." The air around her was so cold it burned, and then the child spoke again. 1 year, 1 life. Before Nora could scream, before she could beg for mercy, the child disappeared into the night, vanishing into the swirling snow. The next morning, The town woke to find the feast hall empty, the food untouched. Nora was gone. No trace of her remained, except for a small, empty basket sitting at the edge of the town square. The villagers searched for her, but she was never found. The Winterbrook feast carried on without her. The town survived the season, but every year since, when the first snowflakes fell, there would be a whisper in the cold wind. Give or take. Over time, the legend of the frostbitten child continued, and though the villagers spoke of the curse in hushed tones, they never forgot. For the stories were true. In Winterbrook, nothing was ever free, and the child, with their empty basket, would always return.